Okay, let's unpack a really fascinating geopolitical puzzle. It's the story of a high-stakes summit, one that was meant to project American strength, but somehow, well, it ended up doing the exact opposite.
And we're kicking things off with this pretty bold claim because it gets right to the core of what we're talking about today. It shows how one single meeting between two leaders sent these massive ripples across the globe, changing relationships thousands of miles away.
So to really get this, our story has to start in Alaska. This is where a really carefully planned summit between the US and Russia was about to set off a chain reaction that honestly I don't think anybody saw coming.
So picture this, August 15th, Alaska. The whole setup was designed for show. You know, you've got the full military ceremony, lavish praise for Putin, the works. But when you look past all that pageantry, what was actually accomplished? Well, not much. On the big issue, Ukraine, there was zero breakthrough. So the result? Putin gets to fly home looking like a big winner and equal on the world stage, while President Trump was left with pretty much nothing to show for it.
Now here's the thing. While all the cameras were focused on that handshake and the lack of a deal, another major world power was watching, very, very closely. For India, this summit wasn't just some diplomatic theater. It was a threat, hiding in plain sight.
And that brings us right to the heart of America's big gamble. A pretty risky attempt to squeeze one of its most critical partners in the entire Indo-Pacific region.
You see, the squeeze was already on. The U.S. had already hit Indian exports with a 25% tariff, but now it was threatening to double down with these really damaging secondary tariffs, aimed squarely at India's energy relationship with Russia.
And just listen to the timing and the language of this threat from Trump. It came right after the Putin meeting, and it's so intentionally vague. It directly tied the fate of those tariffs to what happened at the summit. The unspoken message here was crystal clear. India was now a pawn in America's game with Russia.
And this is where it gets really awkward, because it highlights this massive contradiction in what the US was doing. Washington was threatening to punish India for buying Russian energy, but at the same time, its own trade with Russia had shot up by 20%. It was a bit of hypocrisy that Vladimir Putin himself was, more than happy to point out.
So, with all this pressure, you might think India would fold, right? Nope. Not even close. Instead, it began to make its own moves on the global chessboard, putting a core principle of its foreign policy on full display for everyone to see.
Okay, before we get into what India did, we really need to understand this key concept, multi-alignment. Just think of it like this. It's all about strategic independence. It means you keep good relationships with all the major players, the US, Russia, China, without getting locked into an alliance with any single one of them.
And India's response? It was fast, it was strategic, and it was all about sending a message. I mean, look at this timeline. On the very same day as the Alaska summit, Prime Minister Modi says India will never compromise on its core interests. Bam! Just 3 days later, who shows up in New Delhi? China's foreign minister. And less than a week after that, India's top diplomat is in Moscow. The timing here was absolutely not a coincidence.
The message behind all these moves was impossible to miss. It was India saying, look, we value our partnership with the West, but we are not going to be anyone's junior partner. Their sovereignty, their right to make their own decisions, was simply not for sale.
So let's step back. How did this big power play actually turn out for the United States? Well, to put it bluntly, it backfired, big time. It ended up hurting the very interests the U.S. was trying to protect.
I mean, the results were the complete opposite of what Washington wanted. The goal was to isolate Russia, right? Instead, the U.S. risked pushing away its most important partner in the Indo-Pacific. The pressure didn't pull India away from Moscow, it shoved them closer together. And maybe the biggest surprise of all, it actually cracked open the door for a little bit of a diplomatic thaw between two rivals, India and China.
And it wasn't just a few people noticing this. Prominent analysts like Fareed Zakaria were calling it out almost immediately as a huge, possibly historic mistake. He basically argued that Trump was throwing away 25 years of American foreign policy that had been carefully built by both parties to bring India in as a strategic partner.
And Zakaria's point was that this wasn't just about a bad policy move, it was about something deeper, trust. This one action showed allies all over the world that the U.S. might be willing to treat its friends badly just to score a short-term point. It made Washington look, well, fundamentally unreliable.
So this whole episode, it wasn't just a failed strategy. It was a sign of a much bigger shift happening in global politics. It revealed this new reality, one that's really defined by this idea of multi-alignment. So at the end of the day, India's message became incredibly clear. And it wasn't just for Washington, it was for the whole world. India is going to walk its own path, it's going to pursue multi-alignment, it's going to guard its sovereignty with everything it has, and no amount of outside pressure is going to change that.
And all of this leaves us with a really big question to think about. As the great powers, the US, China, Russia, compete more and more fiercely, is this multi-aligned path going to become the new playbook for other nations who are caught in the middle, just trying to navigate this increasingly messy world?